The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the March installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series. My name is Lisa Martone, Sales Executive for Clinical Conductor CTMS, and I will be your moderator for the webinar today. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I want to share. First, we will be providing a copy of the presentation via email within 24 hours of the webinar ending. Please be sure to check the email you used to register for the webinar. Also, we will be doing a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please submit any questions you have at any time using the GoToWebinar questions box on the right side of your screen. Today's presentation is titled Business Development for Clinical Research Sites and will be presented by Chris Fraze and Michael Brody of Pharmaceutical. As the Site Selection Manager at Pharmaceutical, Chris Fraze is responsible for providing pharmaceutical companies and CROs with high-quality research sites for their trials, and for exposing Pharmaceutical's site network to new study opportunities and working closely with them throughout the pre-selection process. He brings nearly 14 years of industry experience into his relationships with sites, investigators, sponsors, and CROs. Michael Brody is the Business Development Account Executive for Pharmaceutical, an investigative site network that collaborates with pharmaceutical companies and contract research organizations to match them with qualified clinical investigative sites for participation in clinical trials. With over 7 years in the preclinical and clinical industry, Michael oversees the dedicated business development team and assists in identifying potential clinical trials for the site network. And with that, I'll hand it over to Pharmaceutical.
Thank you, Bio-Optronics, for that brief introduction and the kind words. I want to apologize in advance.
Muted.
This is Mike Brody. I'm going to do the first half of our presentation before I hand off to Chris, but I want to apologize in advance because I do have a little tickle in my throat, so if I start coughing, I'll try to mute it as fast as possible, but I can't guarantee anything. We're going to jump in right away because we have a fair amount of information we would like to share with you. As you can see by the title, the presentation is going to focus on how to sell your sites to the sponsors and CROs through the initial stages of a clinical trial. The agenda here, I would like to start off with a few slides on the current state of the industry. As we all know, the pharmaceutical industry is continually changing, especially over the past few years. The more we know about the industry, the better we can prepare for the adjustments we anticipate. Then we'll move on to some of the best practices for identifying studies. I will go over some resources that I personally use, as well as provide tips on how to better sell your site to a sponsor and CRO. Then I'll pass off the presentation to my colleague, Chris Fraze, to go over completing questionnaires and initial documents. Hopefully you'll see how once you receive the study, you're still not done selling your site and doing business development. Chris will go through 6 tips on how to complete the initial documents and ultimately secure the study. And lastly, we'll talk about maintaining and continuing the relationships you have. As we all know, research and development costs are growing exponentially, especially as drug companies start to focus on personal medicine. In order to decrease costs, pharmaceutical companies are merging and acquiring at a rapid rate. In addition to decreasing costs and increasing revenue, these consolidations are helping large companies gain influence and eliminate competition. By merging, they're diversifying their therapeutic indications, which helps maintain and gain market share. The consolidations are also helping protect against patent cliffs from large blockbuster drugs. A perfect example of this is Pfizer. Pfizer's profit dropped 14% in 2012 once their blockbuster drug Lipitor lost U.S. exclusivity. The important thing to note is that we expect to see additional mergers in the near future. Pharmaceutical companies are seeing mergers and acquisitions as a viable alternative to research and development. Rather than spend billions of dollars and years in research and development on a competing drug, they're deciding to purchase the original drug and gain market share immediately. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide, but as Lisa said, you guys will be receiving the slide, so you can open it up at a later time. I just want to simply illustrate how the pharmaceutical industry has changed over the past 20 years. This graph shows how over 60 drug companies have merged into 10 major pharmaceutical companies in the past 20 years. Specifically, if you focus on the last 3 years, 14 deals over $1 billion have taken place. Again, this is a trend we expect to continue in the future as pharmaceuticals seeing mergers and acquisitions as a viable alternative to research and development. Moving forward, part of the reason, as stated previously, for the mergers is that sponsors have been moving from a high-volume, low-margin business model to a low-volume, high-margin model. They're spending a significant portion of their research and development budget on personal medicine, such as orphan drugs, specialty pharmaceuticals, and targeted therapy drugs. The patient population for these drugs is much smaller than something like a highly competitive diabetes drug, but the profit margin is much higher. One of the reasons behind this transition to personal medicine, such as those listed above, is that insurance providers are requiring more information on the effectiveness and value of the new drugs in development. Insurance companies are not willing to spend more money on a slightly better drug when a perfectly good one already exists in the market. As you can see by the chart below, it illustrates what we've been seeing over the past couple of years. Oncology, rheumatology, hematology, and cardiovascular drugs are the primary focus of the industry. One area we have also been seeing a lot of growth personally, especially in 2015 and 2016, is gastroenterology, and more specifically in the area of ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. If you're a site and you know of any gastroenterologists who are interested in conducting research, right now is a great time to get them in. There is an overwhelming amount of trials going on right now in need of GI doctors. To piggyback off the previous chart, this graph illustrates how the drug market has changed in the past 20 years. If we were to step back 20 years, we were seeing a significant amount of drugs coming onto the market, specifically in the area of anti-infectives, cardiovascular, and CNS. Fast forward 20 years, and you'll see the major majority of drug approvals, roughly approximately 30% of the drugs coming onto the market are for cancer, while anti-infectives and cardiology drugs have dropped off. Interestingly enough, however, CNS drugs have been steady throughout the past 2 decades. There we go. Another trend we see moving forward in the future is that biosimilar drugs are starting to make their way into the U.S. market. The FDA established and approved the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act in 2009 as part of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. This, combined with recent patent expirations, have paved way for biosimilars introductions into the U.S. market. Just a little background, the first biosimilar product approved under this new pathway was Xerixia in March 2015. Currently, there are 13 pharmaceutical companies which have 30 to 40 molecules in the late-stage clinical trials. Here's just a quick graph which highlights a few of the biosimilars expecting to enter the market in the near future. Obviously, with 30 to 40 molecules, this does not represent all. So with all of this industry information, what does it mean to you? First of all, with mergers, expect studies to take longer in startup or potentially be canceled. We currently are working on a study right now where one pharmaceutical company bought the rights to a drug undergoing a clinical trial. This has caused the entire trial to go on hold for an unknown amount of time. This especially hurts your pocketbook if you are expecting a clinical trial to come in and you're expecting to enroll a lot of patients on that trial. You're going to have to be waiting a substantial amount of time while these mergers take place. You're also seeing increased competition among sites for common therapeutic areas as research and development is focused more money on personalized medicine. This is why it's so important when to sell our sites. We want to stand out from the crowd so that when a good opportunity comes along, we're able to capitalize on it. Conversely, if you're a specialized or more diversified site, expect to see growth in the areas mentioned earlier. Oncology will continue to be a focus for sponsors, but there's also an opportunity in GI, rheumatology, and CNS. We're also seeing that there will be an opportunity to participate in late-phase clinical trials. As biosimilars become more prominent and the FDA does more fast-tracking, late-stage clinical trials will become more available. And as mentioned earlier, you will see an expanding opportunity in biosimilar clinical trials as they continue to make as they continue to make their way into the United States. So now we have an overview of the industry. How do we capitalize on the opportunities that come our way? Everyone should know that it starts with the ability to efficiently and effectively identify clinical trials. Most sites do not have the luxury to have a dedicated business development person identifying trials at all hours. Therefore, we need to figure out how to best utilize public resources so that we're working smarter, not harder. Once we identify the trials, we need to build those meaningful relationships as to not lose out on future opportunities. There's a lot of data out there on current clinical trials. I've compiled a short list of databases and resources I use on a regular basis to identify trials. I assume most of you have all heard of clinicaltrials.gov, which is a database of publicly and privately supported clinical trials worldwide. This site provides an overwhelming amount of information, including sponsor, indication, phase, and a brief synopsis of the trial. One resource many of you have probably not heard of, and the one I personally like to use, is the International Clinical Trials Registry Platform, which is hosted by the World Health Organization. They both will pull in the same information, but I just found the database easier to use. In either case, use the advanced search function and try to narrow down your variables as much as possible to avoid getting overwhelmed by information. Fierce Pharma and the FDA News Daily Bulletin are free daily newsletters which you can subscribe to. There are a few versions for each. I know the FDA News has both a drug and device newsletter, and Fierce Pharma has the vaccines newsletter as well. I've also included CenterWatch on this list as a personal resource I use. It's a weekly and monthly electronic publication providing news and leads. However, please note that this is a subscription service. I do want to point out that CenterWatch hosts a website called TrialWatch. This is an investigator database where you can submit summaries of your offerings and expertise to CenterWatch and are then entered into their database for sponsors and CROs. The last I've included is LinkedIn. For those of you who may not know or think to use LinkedIn as a resource, it's an online business-oriented social networking service. It's an extremely valuable resource when trying to track down new people at sponsors and CROs. It also can be used as a resource when a sponsor or CRO has gone dark on you and you're just looking for updates to existing studies. There we go. So with all the public resources I've just mentioned, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. For example, typing in influenza into clinicaltrials.gov yields 540 open studies. It's a very inefficient way to go through all 540 studies, especially when you're devoting an hour, maybe two of your day to business development. Here are the three main drawbacks of the resources I've mentioned. Data can be outdated, especially on websites like clinicaltrials.gov and the International Clinical Trials Registry Platform. Sometimes the status of a clinical trial will not show up for months, and you're left wondering what's happened to a given study. When doing a search, you're also presented with vague status information about recruiting, such as recruiting, not yet recruiting, active, not yet recruiting. It's nearly impossible to determine which clinical trials are currently in the startup phase, enrolling, or need add-on sites. Lastly, all the databases and resources listed on the previous page provide limited contact information. Unless you have an established contact at the sponsor CRO, you're left in the dark as far as who to contact for next steps. So I'm sure you're asking yourself, what's the point of providing all these resources if there's so many holes in the information? Well, clinicaltrials.gov and the International Clinical Trial Registry Platform can still provide a good snapshot of a study, and if, on the off chance, they do provide contact information, you know that contact at least has some oversight of the study. There are also good databases in case you decide to participate as an add-on site. They will give you the synopsis information and allow you to make an informed decision as to if it is a good fit for your site. The newsletters provide a lot of information from a high level and can be used as a proactive resource. As you can see in the FDA News Drug Daily Bulletin on this page, Amgen and USB have a quick article about a phase 3 drug meeting its primary endpoint. We can assume, based off this information the article provides, it will be continuing development and may present an opportunity for you to get involved at a late phase in the study. So at this point, I'm sure you're thinking, what's the best approach if I have 1 or 2 hours a day? Make the sponsors or CROs come to you. First of all, leverage existing relationships. If you've done any research in the past, you've worked with feasibility people, project managers, study managers, CRAs, etc. It never hurts to ask them for additional studies or who would be the best to contact for future studies. Create site marketing material to share with sponsors and CROs. Make sure your website is up to date and create a sell sheet. As you can see in the lower right, the sell sheet outlines the strengths of the site. Show your qualifications, personnel experience, equipment, any enrollment successes you've had over the years. Treat business development like a job interview and the sell sheet like your resume. Let the sponsor or CRO know why they should choose you. The next point is very tedious for a lot of sites, but also the point I stress the most. Enter your site information into whatever PI databases are available and make sure the information is up to date as possible. When you're reaching out to new sponsors and CROs, ask if they have a database and if you can put your information in it. The vast majority do, and even though it's time consuming, once it's set up, it's the easiest way to make sure the sponsors and CROs are coming to you. Find out who to contact. This is where LinkedIn becomes a really valuable resource. Let's assume you've leveraged one of your contacts who's an existing CRA. They may not be able to help you, but they let you know their CRO has a dedicated feasibility department. Go to LinkedIn and find contacts in that department. Introduce yourself, your site, and provide your sell sheet. The more active interest you show in finding new studies, the better chance you will have being recognized and remembered. A quick side story, we have a colleague who used to do feasibility for a large CRO. She mentioned that any time a site contacted her and presented a sell sheet to her, they went into a separate pile. And whenever a new study came through, she went through that pile before approaching the rest of her PI database. Lastly, you can consider joining a network. There are a lot of networks out there. ISNs, TMOs, SMOs, brokers. Each has a tweaked business model. Before you join the network, make sure you understand what you are committing to. It will avoid a lot of surprises down the road. Why join a network? Most networks have a dedicated business development team who constantly work to build relationships with sponsors and CROs. By joining, you're leveraging their relationships and having them work for you. On the last slide I'm presenting, we're going to emphasize additional ways to build meaningful relationships outside of LinkedIn and leveraging contacts. Attend conferences. There are a lot of conferences out there which cater to the site. Sponsors and CROs attend these conferences to find good sites like yours. My suggestion is before you even attend the conference, look to see who the key speakers are for the sessions, and if they have a relevant title, send an email introducing yourself and asking for a meeting. Obviously, you want to go to the sessions, but most importantly, go to the networking events. Some of the best contacts I've made are from conference networking events. I may also suggest networking with other sites. As long as the site is not competing with you directly, you can build a meaningful relationship and share information between yourselves, such as sponsor and CRO contacts and any feasibilities you may have received. Last but not least, stay in touch with everybody you meet. Even if it was a quick introduction and an exchange of business cards at a conference, send a thank you email. Do not assume because you have made one good connection at a sponsor or CRO that you'll be told about all future studies. So you've done your business development, efforts have paid off, and you have a study in your hands. Now what? In this next section, I'm going to hand off to Chris Faves, who will go over some tips on how to rerun a study.
Great, thank you, Mike. So this section I'm going to focus on once you actually have that feasibility survey in your hands, how to use that as a sort of another next step or another form, a softer form of business development. So first, I want to take a little step back and show some facts and figures, a little background on where we're at in the industry. Since these figures are certainly in the back of the sponsor's mind when they were looking at hundreds of questionnaires for a study that come in. So the figures on this slide, they're all from a tough study that was released in January 2013, where they analyzed over 150 trials involving about 16,000 sites worldwide. They found that for a given study, about 11% of sites won't enroll a single subject, and 37% will enroll at least one, but they'll miss it, they won't hit the enrollment goal that the sponsor set. On the other side, 39% of sites will meet that goal, and 13% will over-enroll. So this means that nearly half of all sites on a given study won't meet the target that the sponsor set. From a sponsor perspective, that's a huge waste of time, money, and resources. And Tufts also found that while 9 out of 10 studies will meet their overall enrollment goals, the downside is that sponsors often have to double the original length of the study in order to do so. And other research has shown that on average, over 80% of trials don't meet the sponsor's original timeline, mainly due to poor enrollment. It costs sponsors over $40,000 a day to keep a trial running just in direct costs. So that doesn't even doesn't even take into consideration the loss of potential revenue from delaying the IP from hopefully eventually reaching the market. And that loss is usually estimated somewhere around $1 million per day. Also, poor choices in site selection can increase the cost of a trial by 20% or more. Part of this cost includes activating and then closing out non-performing sites. So if a site doesn't enroll a single subject, the sponsor just wasted over $30,000 to get them activated, just to have to close them down with no return on their investment. So poor site selection can obviously have a devastating impact on the sponsor's pocketbook. So with this in mind, how can you stand out from the crowd and sell your site to the sponsor? On these next set of slides, I'm going to go over these 6 tips on basically how you can do just that. Our first tip is put yourself in the sponsor's shoes so you can position your site accordingly. So what do sponsors want? Well, first, they obviously want sites that will meet or exceed the enrollment goal with maximum subject retention and a low screen fail ratio. So this one's pretty obvious. There's not much need to go into detail there. They want sites that will succeed in performing their studies. They also want sites that produce clean and high-quality data. And so all the patients that you enroll won't mean anything if your data is unusable and they have to throw it out, or if they have to spend extraordinary amount of time and resources cleaning up that data and getting queries resolved. Sponsors also want experienced, enthusiastic, and highly involved investigators, coordinators, and other research staff who meet their qualifications for that study. The sponsors usually want the PI to have previous trial experience, whether just in general or in the particular indication. So this can make breaking into research or new indications very difficult. You run into a situation where they require experience, but they don't have the experience, but then you can't get any experience anywhere in order to get those new studies. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. So obviously that makes, as I said, makes getting into research difficult. But as long as there's someone at the site who brings that experience to the table, such as a sub-investigator or coordinator, sponsors are often willing to accept that in lieu of the PI's experience. So obviously there are some situations where there's, it doesn't matter how much experience anyone else has. If the PI is new to research, they're not going to consider, but consider your site. But it's always worth exploring and seeing if they will, if they will accept other experience instead of that. And to this point again, enthusiasm. That goes a long way towards both securing the current opportunity and keeping your site in the front of the sponsor's mind when they need to find sites for the next trial. Having a PI who is actively involved during the selection process, and especially during phone calls or pre-study visits, it gives the sponsor confidence that that PI is going to make their study a top priority. We've seen, in our experience, otherwise highly qualified sites get turned down for studies just solely because the PI hadn't looked at the protocol before the PSV, or they appear distracted and bored to the CRA. And the next point, sponsors also want sites with access to the patient population as well as a realistic and aggressive recruitment plan. So these qualities go hand in hand. If you have all the patients, but you have no idea how you're going to recruit them for your study, you're just hoping that they're going to fall into it. That's not very helpful. And likewise, if you have a great plan, but you have no way to find these patients, no access, no referral networks, no anything, that's negative as well. So both these qualities, they go hand in hand. So you always want to explain to the sponsor both where you're going to find these potential participants, and then how you're going to get them interested in that study. What you're going to do to get them to be receptive and want to enroll. The sponsors also want sites with a clean audit history, or if you have a 483 or results from a negative result from a sponsor audit, they obviously want evidence that those issues were addressed and taken care of, and that you have an adequate capital plan in place, and that obviously those issues won't pop up again. So I'll be going over that issue in more detail in the future slide, but I did want to just mention that. And then obviously it's not an exhaustive list, but as far as these points go, finally they want sites that can get up and running quickly. So if you have to run a study through a local IRB, that's obviously can be a severe detriment to your selectability, especially if it's a study where there are hospitalized patients or a rare indication where most of these sites are going to be using central or local IRBs. That may not be as big of a deal, but if it's a diabetes study and you have to go through local while everyone else can use a central IRB, that's a much greater strike against your site. It's also the same if you have a legal department that takes a month to review a contract and then quibbles with every other sentence of the contract, or if you have other committees that need to review and approve the protocol before you can take on a study. So if there are other sites that can perform just as well in the study and move much more quickly, why would the sponsor pick your site? So obviously you may not have any control over some of these matters, especially if you're an academic center or you're at a large hospital and there's bureaucracy, or you're not able to move those mountains that need to be moved to take care of those issues. So you may just need to compensate elsewhere when you're selling your site to the sponsor. Now our second tip is to treat the questionnaire like a job interview. Just like you'd research a company and the position before you apply, you should make sure to ask the sponsor any questions you have about the study and what they're looking for in a potential candidate. Sometimes the sponsor may just send out a few sentences about the study, or not even that. If you don't have enough information, see if the sponsor is able to share things like a synopsis, inclusion-exclusion criteria, or a schedule of events. They may not have these ready or available yet, but never hurts to ask, and it shows them that you're eager to learn more about their study. You can try asking for a budget at that stage, but in most cases, the sponsor may not even have one put together yet, or they may not be willing to share that information until you're actively under consideration for that study. But hopefully, you can at least get some sort of estimate or per patient, per subject ballpark figure at least, or some other bits and pieces to help you decide if that study will be worth your time. You may also want to confirm with them what stage the study is in. Is this a pre-awarded opportunity where you're working with a CRO that's bidding for this trial against other CROs? If so, then that study could end up with a different CRO, and that opportunity may disappear. Is it a new study that hasn't started yet, and they're actively selecting sites? And obviously, that's usually the ideal scenario. The trial is definitely moving forward. They're looking for sites right now, so there's a very they need your site. Or is it an add-on or rescue opportunity? I'll go over more of those in more detail later, but obviously it's very important to know if your opportunity falls in that category. And many times they aren't upfront with that, or they don't mention that it is an ongoing study where it's a rescue opportunity. So you definitely want to confirm before you spend too much time on filling out the questionnaires and promoting yourself for that study. Another question to ask yourself is, do these patients actually exist? As you're all probably aware, inclusion-exclusion criteria lists keep getting longer and more complicated. It makes it more and more difficult to find eligible patients. If you do feel you have access to enough eligible patients, will they be receptive and enthusiastic about that study? So you want to look at the study from the perspective of your patients. Are there any procedures involved that may drive potential subjects away? Are there, such as invasive biopsies, lumbar punctures, infant blood draws? You want to take a look at those and see if that's going to be an obstacle for you. Is the time commitment potentially excessive? For example, for a cardiovascular outcome study, where there's maybe a 5-year follow-up period, so you have to keep track of those patients for that long. They may move away or disappear, so this can be very difficult to retain subjects. Or if you have a flu study where the subjects have to come in for 5 consecutive days while they're sick with the flu, obviously that's going to be difficult to get some patients on board. Also, will factors like placebo or washout period or inadequate rescue medication be a deal breaker for patients? And also, are there already treatments on the market that work and are affordable, or does the study target an underserved population, which would make recruitment obviously much easier? And the final question here that you may want to ask yourself, are the enrollment goal and enrollment time frame realistic? Do you feel confident that you can meet that sponsor's goal? All right, and here are some additional examples of things you can do to make a positive impression during your study application, aka your job interview. Now, most of these are pretty self-explanatory, so I'll go through them pretty quickly. For the first 3 points, they're all kind of tied together. I know questionnaires can be very tedious. The questions can be very repetitive. Every survey asks if you have a fax machine, can you email, do you have internet connection? So it can get tiring, and it's easy to switch to autopilot mode and just check boxes and put down one-word answers. But this is your opportunity to really sell yourself in your site and make your case for why you should be on that study. It really is another softer form of business development and marketing. Don't leave any blanks, and take advantage of any open-ended questions and comment sections to provide extra details about your site, your PI, your experience, your qualifications, so that you can make sure you're catching the sponsor's eye. And then I'll run through the rest of these pretty quickly. Have a standard process in place to ensure the study is a good fit and help you highlight your selling points. Now, it can be very difficult when many sponsors and CROs want surveys back within a few days. But if you're not already doing so, try to establish some sort of, at least an informal feasibility review where the PI coordinator and anyone else who will be involved in the trial can get together, review all the available information, and determine together if that opportunity is worth pursuing. And while you're identifying any potential concerns and obstacles that anyone might come up with, also you can see if there's any selling points that you have of why you would be a great fit for that trial. If the PI had done some research at a previous site for this indication, has extensive history with that, that's obviously something that would be helpful. Or any other points that you definitely want to make sure that you're getting across on that questionnaire. The next point is to include site promotional materials with your submission. So when you're sending back that questionnaire, if you want to include, if you have a brochure or a sell sheet, CVs, a link to your website if you have one, obviously that's really key. If you have a list of studies you've done, if you have a sort of sell sheet with just one page of, like have a table of what studies you've done, some brief information about those, that's always very helpful to include. You want to keep enrollment metrics of your studies and use them to support your case. So that would be very helpful. A lot of questionnaires will have a table where you're having to fill out how you've done on previous studies. So if you have that information handy, that makes it that much easier. And even if you're not asked for that information, if there's a comment section that you definitely include, if you've done 20 studies with this indication and you've knocked them all in the park, be sure to mention that. And finally here, if you're trying to break into a new therapeutic area, kind of include an explanation of why they should take a chance on your site. If you're PI's cardiologist and he's submitting for an allergy study, it may be a great fit. Maybe he just kind of oversees the study conduct while there are specialist sub-Is who are actually seeing the patients and the subjects and taking care of that day-to-day study conduct or something. So it's definitely important to, if you're trying to get in there, explain why you deserve to be on that study and what you can bring to that study so that the sponsor doesn't just automatically, throw your survey in the dustbin. Our next tip is to underpromise and overdeliver. So by way of introduction, I just want to bring up Lasagnas Law. Dr. Louis Lasagna, who is known as father of clinical pharmacology, made several crucial contributions to research. He also stated what became known as Lasagnas Law, which is here. And simply put, it's that sites are optimistic about their enrollment capabilities and will generally overestimate the number of patients that they can actually enroll in a trial. And sponsors of the CROs operate with this law or some variation of it in their mind, whether consciously or not. If they're seeing sites present, extremely high enrollment projections, they'll usually they may often cut them, by anywhere from a third, a half, or even as much as 90% to what they feel is more realistic. So if your enrollment estimates are 5 times higher than everyone else's, the sponsor's first inclination is probably to assume that you're either overly optimistic and maybe haven't had any experience with this indication before, as far as clinical trials go, or that you're inflating your numbers to get on their list. And not that you can do such a better job than everyone else, unless you can support it with facts and evidence. So that in mind, if your numbers may appear to be on the high side, but you feel strongly that your estimates are accurate, you want to back them up with evidence, such as from database queries or your EMR system, or with any historical metrics you have from previous similar studies. When you're providing enrollment projections, try to visualize how your patients will respond to the study when they're presented with it, and how factors like the ones that I've listed here may eat into your initial prediction. In the end, you basically want to be somewhat conservative without undercutting yourself, and don't promise more than you can realistically expect to deliver. Our fourth tip is to anticipate red flags. When you're filling out that questionnaire, kind of look at your answers, either as you're filling out the questionnaire or at the end before you submit it back, and look for any answers that you're providing that may make the sponsor hesitate or just disregard your questionnaire. So I put a couple examples here. For a question you may get is how many diabetes patients do you treat per month? And if you're a dedicated research facility, you don't see patients outside of trials, you may put 0. So you definitely want to boost that answer, may explain that you're a dedicated research facility, which is why you don't see these patients, but list the size of your database, how many of them may be eligible for this study. If you have, there in another section explain your experiences area, etc. So don't just obviously put 0. Another example of how many studies has your PI conducted. If he's a new PI or she, your answer will be 0. So you'll again want to boost that with more facts that can make your case for you. So you might want to explain that he's done GCP they've done GCP training, if they've been to sub-I on other studies, and then go into details about your site as a whole, your coordinator's experience, any sub-I experience. Just obviously don't leave it at 0. So when you fill out that questionnaire, you want to read this answers back to yourself from the sponsor's perspective, and just think if you were the sponsor, would this answer cause you some concern? Okay. And some more possible red flags. If you've had a negative experience on a trial, you're filling out that table with the enrollment history, and there's a study you didn't do so well on. Think back to the circumstances of that trial. Was it an especially difficult protocol? Were other sites having the same experience? Did no one really enroll in that study? So it's not specifically just your site. Was it a rescue add-on situation? Where the protocol, again, is going to be usually a difficult protocol, which is why you need more sites. Or did the sponsor close the study early? Did you get up and running and then they closed a week later, so you didn't enroll anyone? If there are any of these situations, you definitely want to provide some explanation with that answer to show the sponsor why why those numbers may be lower. And if there were no external causes and you just didn't perform well, provide them with any lessons that you learned from that study and how you avoid repeat performance, so that they hopefully don't have to be concerned about how you perform in their trial. Another possible red flag, if it's a PI, either breaking into a new indication, or maybe the PI is a research-only PI, is cardiologist, but he does studies in many other indications outside of that specialty. You want to explain why they would be a good fit. Explain how much experience they have. Do they work with sub-Is who are in that given indication or therapeutic area specialty, who would be treating these patients, have access to those patients, and experience treating that indication? And is the PI going to be more there to oversee the actual the research part of it, to make sure that the regulations are followed and everything? So that's another area where you'll want to beef up your response with some evidence and facts and figures to support your case. Okay. And then what to do if you have a 43 in your record. Now, first, you obviously want to be honest and upfront. Most sponsors, in our experience, maybe 9 out of 10 times, they'll take the circumstances into consideration. How long ago the 43 was, how severe the findings were, your response, or the capital plan that you've hopefully put in place since then. If the FDA has visited your site since then and hopefully had a positive experience, they usually take these into consideration, won't just bar you from the site because of 43. That said, there are cases where sponsors or CROs just will not accept a site with 43. I just came across that a week ago. We had a site that does great work. They have 43 in the record from years ago with a PI who's no longer there. They've got new staff since then. The FDA even came to their site later and had a great audit. They sent them a letter. Should provide the sponsor that that there are no significant findings. The capital plan looks like it's been implemented. Everything looks great, and the sponsor still just flat out rejected them. So sometimes you just have to cut your losses, but most of the time, a 43 is not the curse of death that it used to be. And so when you're sending that 43, which you always want to do, be upfront and send that to the sponsor CRO, not just when they're asking it, but be upfront, because that is going to come up down the line eventually. You want to definitely include, obviously, a response letter and any subsequent responses from the FDA, such as confirmation that you addressed their findings adequately and that your capital plan, if it's implemented as you've described it will be, that's acceptable. So that's definitely helpful to make your case. Also, if you've had anyone independently audit your site since then, if you have documentation of that, that's certainly helpful. Or if the FDA themselves have done subsequent audits, if they've sent letters, especially if they sent letters to that fact, send those to sponsors as well. And also on the flip side, if you were audited and you didn't have any significant findings and no 43s were issued, you may want to send that sponsor or CRO that confirmation letter, even if they don't ask it. And that's obviously a good sign if the FDA came and they found nothing, everything looked great. So that's a good selling point. And then, Sorry about that. Our fifth tip is to meet your deadlines. The first impression a sponsor will typically get from your site is how quickly and accurately you complete and return initial paperwork. A site that takes 3 weeks to get the PI to sign a CDA or leaves a third of the survey unanswered comes across as a site that doesn't really care whether or not they get the study. And plus your performance in these initial stages, it sets the tone for the sponsor's expectations of how you'll perform on the trial. If you have to miss a deadline, let the sponsor or CRO know. These deadlines are generally not set in stone, but this way the sponsor or CRO knows that you're still interested in their study, and they'll appreciate your level of communication and your consideration. One thing I do want to mention is for pre-awarded studies where a CRO is bidding with the sponsor for, yours typically have very tight turnaround times. They often want responses within 24, 48, 72 hours. But if you are able to meet those timelines, you may have a leg up on the competition. They need feedback right away for their bid proposal. So if they get a large enough response from sites at that stage, they might not need to reach out to other sites later on or accept additional questionnaires after that date. So if you can meet those deadlines, that puts you in a very good place when they are actually going to be looking for sites. And finally here, sponsors are keeping track of document turnaround times as well as CROs for questionnaires, CDAs, and other documents. So if you're repeatedly missing deadlines, that can hurt your chances for selection, even if you may be a perfect site for the trial. And our sixth tip is to be proactive and follow up. Don't just wait for the sponsor CRO to contact you. Follow up with them after you've turned in everything. Not only will you avoid getting lost in the shuffle, but also shows that you're excited about their study. And it never hurts to pick up the phone instead of just emailing them. Sometimes actually speaking to someone can make a huge difference. You can start this right after you send out your questionnaire or CDA. Make sure they actually got your survey, whether you emailed, faxed it, or filled out online. Things get lost in cyberspace. There's definitely we've had experiences where sites complete the online questionnaires, submit them, but the CRO never gets them. So, if we or the site hadn't followed up, they would never have gotten that opportunity. And then find out what your next steps are. They may not expect anything to happen for a long time. Then, in that case, follow up with the sponsor CRO periodically, but make sure to respect their time and just your follow-up attempts to the time frames they provide. If the sponsor says the study is on hold for 6 months, don't call them in 2 weeks looking for an update. If you're working with the CRO, try to find out if the study has actually been awarded to them. Oftentimes, they'll send out questionnaires to get information for the bid defense, and if that's the case, it could be months or even a year or more before they find out if they've even won the study, much less when they're going to begin selecting sites. And if they lose the bid, the opportunity will generally vanish as well. So it may be a while before you hear anything depending on the study. Keep track of the studies you submitted to. If you set up a spreadsheet or some other system where you can keep track of these opportunities, include information like the sponsor, the CRO, their contact information, the indication, the date you submitted for the trial, and anything else you like to keep track of. Some sponsors and CROs are great about sending out updates and notifying sites if they're not selected, but with others you may have to do some detective work. And then if you are rejected for a study, try to find out why. You may not always get an answer or the answer that you'd like, but you may get some valuable feedback in case there's anything you need to fix so that you have better odds for next time. And a final bonus tip is to know when to say no. They may be seen counterintuitive, but knowing when to walk away from the study opportunity is an underrated talent. In our experience, some of the best performing sites are the ones that actually turn down most of the opportunities that they receive. You want to cast a wide net, but don't take every study that comes your way. Don't take on competing trials or studies you know that you won't do well on. Taking on too many bad studies leaves you unable to consider better opportunities down the road, and it can drag your metrics and reputation down. And don't be afraid that the sponsor won't come back to you for future studies if you say no to this one. If they've contacted you for one study, odds are you're in their system, and they'll probably come back to you the next time they need sites for a trial. It's much better to run that risk than to take on a bad study and perform poorly. And I discussed this in a previous slide, but try to get information if needed so you can make an informed decision. Review the synopsis and schedule events when available. Will everyone at your site actually have time to devote to this trial? Is this a study your investigators, coordinators, and other supporting personnel can get excited about? Your team's morale will play a key role in whether or not the study will be a success for your site. And if you have to turn on a study, let the sponsor know right away. Turning it down after sponsors made a lot of investment in your site definitely leaves a negative impression if it's for a reason that should have been obvious at the outset. Obviously things happen that are unforeseen, but if you know up front that it's not going to be a good study, turn it down as soon as it's feasible. And then be cautious if you get an opportunity for a site that's already begun enrolling subjects. Because sometimes a site may have just started and the sponsor is still working on selection phase while initial sites are enrolling. So that may be fine. Other times it's a site that's been active for a while and they need rescue or add-on sites. And that can be a negative or a positive. There's obviously the risk of enrollment closing before you're up and running, or before you can enroll enough sites on the subjects on the trial to at least break even on it. Now, these studies are also typically difficult to enroll. Otherwise, the sponsor wouldn't be looking for more sites. But if it's a study that's for an indication that's in your wheelhouse, and you can make a great impression on the sponsor if it is one that you'd be successful at. So you'll always want to find out why exactly the sponsor needs more sites, and then decide if the study is worth the risk for you. And for these opportunities, don't be afraid to ask questions like, what's the reason they need more sites? How long has the study been open? When will the enrollment period end? Sometimes these studies are almost finished, so by the time you're IRB approved and contracted and activated, you may find out enrollment's closing in a week. And even if the sponsor tells you you'll have 6 months, if new sites all start enrolling well and enrollment picks up, they could finish that study well ahead of schedule. And then now that you've actually gotten the study, you can focus on continuing that relationship beyond. So first you want to continue relationships you've made with the people you met along the way. Keep the lines of communication open with your CRAs, study managers, and the feasibility staff who initially sent you the questionnaires and CDAs. If you've made a great impression on them, all these people can be invaluable in promoting your site internally for future trials. And then you want to piggyback off your successes. Once you've succeeded on one trial, add it to your sell sheet and use those metrics when applying for future trials, especially for ones on the same indication. And finally, once you have a proven track record, you may want to think about exploring strategic alliances. More and more sponsors and CROs have initiated programs where they have an elite group of sites that are the first to receive new study opportunities. Most of these alliances involve a vetting process, and you'll continually be held up to their high standards. But you will usually have a site manager who's working on behalf of that company and who's automatically submitting your site for new trials as they come up. Once you have a large portfolio of successful studies with the sponsor CRO, reach out to your contacts there and see if they have such a program, and if so, how you can apply. And with that, I'll be turning this over to Mike to wrap this up.
Thank you, Chris. So hopefully we're able to provide some valuable input into not only efficiently identifying the studies up front, but once we identify how to continue selling our site through the feasibility stages. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen, and I think at this time we have a quick sources page, and then we will take questions.
Unmuted.
Thanks, Chris and Michael, for that excellent presentation. Now we'll move into the Q&A portion of the presentation. The first question is, my facility has a central research office, but each department does their own business development. Some are better than others. Do you have any suggestions on how to convince leadership that a dedicated business development position is beneficial?
That's a great question.
Muted.
You know, I try to get a SOP of business development that everybody can share across the board. I understand some are more aggressive in their approach and some are very laid back in their approach. If you try to get a SOP of, you know, we want you to follow up with these contacts within 2 weeks, that's meeting our standards, I think that goes a long way to getting everybody on the same page. I oversee a dedicated business development team, and if, you know, if one is slowly going down, you have to instill a way for them to basically follow a calendar, you know. Reach out to these people at this date, these people at this date. It's tough to get all business development people on the same page, but once the ones who are behind start seeing successes, I think it really motivates them to be a better business development person. Hopefully that answers your question.
Unmuted.
Unfortunately, the next question is, unfortunately, with all the online feasibility surveys that companies send these days, they do not allow for sites to add in additional information or even explain the answers given. It's much more difficult today to sell your site because of the limited information that sites can give in the format provided.
That's definitely something we've come across.
Muted.
It's a kind of a double-edged sword, because the move to online feasibilities, you know, it's obviously much easier for the sponsor CROs to gather that data and you know, import that into their systems. But on the flip side, you know, some of these are pretty frustrating with the way they've locked them down to just check boxes and, you have to enter numbers here only, and it can be very difficult, and sometimes they don't have a comment section. What I've tried to do and to tell staff is to just really squeeze those supporting facts wherever you can. If there's a blank line, any sort of blank space, that even if it's not strictly a comment section, use that. Hopefully the person on the other end will see that information and it'll be used somewhere else. Another thing you can do is just, after you submit that questionnaire, follow up directly with whoever actually sent the opportunity to that link to that survey. Oftentimes we've found that they're willing to, if you send that information separately, if you have, kind of a summary statement or sell sheet about your site, they can email them separately. They may be able to attach that information to your site to that survey you completed on their end. So it's not ideal. Obviously, if you have a comment section, you can fill out, that's much easier. But either if you can shoehorn it somewhere on that survey, or just what's probably easier is just to follow up directly with that person who sent you that survey and send that information separately and try to make sure that they incorporate that information in what you've already provided online.
Unmuted.
The next question is, how many years of 483 should we mention or include?
That's a great question.
Unmuted.
It's not something my experience, I haven't really had a sponsor say, within X number of years. Generally, they just seem to be interested as long as you have 483 on your record. Obviously, if it's from 20 years ago, and your entire staff and PIs have turned over since then, they should hopefully take that, and as long as obviously you've addressed the 483 issues and bounce back from that. Obviously, that shouldn't count as strongly as 483 from last year. But that is a very good question. I would err on the side of including everything. If you do have a substantial number of 483s, follow up with them directly and really try to explain the situations. But honestly, that's a good question. I really haven't seen any specific number of years that they usually want 483s for.
So I just want to chime in from the business development front. We do see a lot of feasibility questionnaire from us as well. We work with a few sponsors and CROs, and their standard number of years tends to be right around the 5-year mark. So if it's beyond 5 years, not a big deal. If it's early or 1 to 5, then they want to see it.
Unmuted.
So the next question is, how do you manage all the opportunities and contacts? Is there a software application or CRM database? I personally would recommend a CTMS, but I don't know about you guys.
Muted.
There's a lot of databases out there. There's a lot of subscription databases out there. We personally use a web-based subscription service where we are able to manage all of our contacts. If you don't want to pay for a CTMS program, you can boil down to as simple as making an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, at the end of the day, as long as you have the key contacts in that Excel spreadsheet, you can always do a Control-F and find whatever contacts you're looking for. And you can split it up amongst 2 sheets if you want to. You can have a sponsor sheet and a CRO sheet, or you can split it among companies if you want to split it among companies. It's however you want to set it up for yourself.
Unmuted.
There are professional programs out there as well that can manage contacts and opportunities and things like that.
All right, the next question is, what is the best conference for making study sponsor connections?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be
Muted.
with you, out of the ones, we go to a fair amount of a fair amount of conferences. The best one that I seem to see is ACRP. It's Site Solution Summit. It's usually in, I think it's the first week of October, or it's either late September or early October. But it's really focused on sites, and it's a really, really good job. There's a lot of huge sponsors and CROs, really high up personnel at that conference. It's a really great resource for, in addition to finding out how to do budgeting and contracting and all of that jazz, there's a lot of really important people at sponsors and CROs, and they usually hold it at a really, really nice place, and the food is outstanding. So
Unmuted.
throw that in there too.
And also, I can chime in too with that conference. It's a lot smaller than some of the other conferences that are out there. It's more intimate, so you may get a lot more one-on-one time with the actual people on the sponsor CRO end that you're trying to find and connect with.
All right, the next question is, what's the best thing a site can do to recruit studies in new therapeutic areas, recruit relevant investigators, etc.?
Right, okay.
Muted.
Yeah, there are a few ways. You know, obviously, if you can make connections with physicians who would be relevant sub-Is, that's a very big help. Who would have access to that population. Yeah, that's simply what we've seen. You know, it's the PI, and you may have the PI, your PI who has the research experience, combining forces with the sub-I specialists who have the patients, and that's usually a really great combination. And sponsors are open to that. That's what I would suggest. I believe.
Unmuted.
Another thing, I mean, like I had mentioned, I don't know how many times, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's and stuff. If there is a huge demand for clinical trials out there in these given areas, it presents more of an opportunity for a research naive or even a sub-I to come in. Sites are really, sponsors and CROs are really desperate for additional sites. And so when you see these overwhelming majority of population or of studies in a given therapeutic area, they're reaching out to whomever they can, even if you are less experienced. And once you get one or two of those studies under your belt, then it's easy to continue rolling in that given therapeutic area.
When is too far in the study acquisition process when turning a study down? Primarily if you are waiting on budget information?
Right. I would feel
Muted.
if you have to turn down any time before the pre-study visit or the qualification visit, wherever they refer to it as, that would be ideal. Because until then, obviously the sponsor and CRO spend time on your site, but they're not, flying out a CRA to your site and putting them up in a hotel and everything. So yeah, I think that's would be much more looked on much more positively, I guess, by the CRO sponsor if you are able to decide before that pre-study visit. Obviously, sometimes that's not feasible. Especially if you don't, a lot of times they won't even have a protocol for your site by the time to visit or a budget. So there are times where you just unfortunately can't make an informed decision on that trial before then. But if you're able to, that's definitely an ideal time, I think, is before the actual visit.
Unmuted.
And we had a question about the name of the conference that you mentioned for making those connections with the sponsors.
Yeah. It's the ACRP, the Site Solution Summit. I believe it's ACRP, correct?
Oh, the Site Solution Summit?
Site Solution Summit. Yep. And I think it's the name of the organization that puts it on is, I believe, ACRP. Am I right?
No, it's Society for
Society. I apologize.
Yeah, it's a Society for
Summit.
And we had another participant suggest Magi as well. So the next question. I'm sorry.
The nice thing about Magi is there's both an east and west. So if you can't make this one conference, you also have two additional opportunities to join or to attend two others.
Okay, and then the next question is, in your experience, how many sponsors actually refer to the site information in their databases? Also, do sponsors have a say in site selection, or do the CROs make that decision?
Muted.
Sponsors more and more are starting to make that decision. What we're seeing is a lot of sponsors are at least providing a preliminary list. It might not be a full site list, but they're providing a preliminary list to the CROs once the CRO is awarded the study. So reaching out to the sponsors more and more is becoming more effective. Unfortunately, with all these mergers, it's becoming really difficult. I mean, especially if you're looking at the Allergan, Actavis, Watson, I think Force was in there at one time or another. They're trying to maintain one database, but it's all over the place. I mean, and you don't really have a single person to contact for that database anymore. So I would say yes, sponsors and CROs are still going to their PI databases quite frequently, especially your smaller to mid CROs. And sponsors are starting to provide preliminary site lists to the CROs, especially for sites that they've worked with in the past that have met enrollment goals.
Unmuted.
What conferences and or resources do you recommend for someone who is new to BD and oncology research?
Pardon me one more time?
What conferences and or resources do you recommend for someone who is new to BD in oncology research?
Probably, and I apologize, I kept saying ACRP with Site Solution Center, but ACRP is a very oncology-focused conference, and that's actually coming up here, I believe, mid-April. So that one focuses mostly on oncology. And this year, I believe it's in Chicago.
And this is the last question. Do sponsors, CROs, consider SMOs favorably during site selection?
To be honest with you, it's hit or miss.
Muted. Unmuted.
They can bring a lot of value to the table, having multiple sites and with one contact. There's some sponsors that are specifically set up to work with SMOs. They have a strategic alliance with SMOs. Our network, for example, if we take our network into example, we have, I think, 3 or 4 strategic partners where we see the entire pipeline coming down. However, there are some sponsors and CROs out there that have had bad experiences, and they just refuse to use any sort of SMO network, site network, TMO, trauma management organization. So it's really going to vary depending on the sponsor or CRO.
All right, that wraps up our Q&A for today. Just a reminder that the slides will be sent out via email within 24 hours after today's presentation. Thank you everyone for attending the presentation today. We hope you found today's presentation interesting and informative. And a big thanks again to Chris and Michael for presenting. Be sure to be on the lookout for the next installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series.
Muted.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it.